Why are Western nations losing Africa? France just got kicked out of another African colony. The UK is watching centuries of influence crumble. Resources that built European wealth for 400 years are being reclaimed by African leaders like Ibrahim Traoré. Politicians call it geopolitics. Economists call it resource nationalism. But what if I told you the Bible predicted this exact scenario 3,000 years ago? The gospel isn't Western. Jesus isn't European. God's kingdom doesn't need the West. When the Western Empire falls and Africa rises, that's not tragedy. That's prophecy. Drop a comment. Do you think we're watching biblical prophecy unfold in real time? Because what's happening in Africa right now isn't just politics. It's the fulfillment of ancient promises about the meek inheriting the earth. Here's what's happening across Africa, and Western media doesn't want you to connect the dots. Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré expels French troops, kicks out Western mining companies, makes education free for every citizen. Mali. Military leaders boot French forces, reclaim gold and uranium resources. Niger. New leadership ends uranium deals that powered French nuclear plants while Nigerians lived in poverty. Chad. Kicks out American military bases, ends decades of Western military presence. One by one, African nations are saying enough to Western exploitation. Leaders are rising who weren't bought, weren't trained in Western schools, weren't groomed to be compliant. And here's what's fascinating. These leaders aren't just reclaiming resources, they're reclaiming dignity. They're saying what colonized people have wanted to say for centuries. You took our wealth, enslaved our people, and called it civilization. We're taking it back. Western Christians are watching this and asking, how did we lose Africa? But that's the wrong question. The right question is, why did God give it back to them? Because there's an ancient prophecy that explains exactly what we're watching. Psalm 68 verse 31, Ethiopia shall stretch out her hands unto God. Now in biblical times, Ethiopia didn't just mean modern-day Ethiopia. It meant all of Africa south of Egypt, the entire continent. And this verse has been called the most important prophecy about African liberation ever written. But here's what Western Christianity missed. This isn't just a nice spiritual metaphor. It's a prophetic promise that Africa would one day rise to meet God on equal terms with the rest of the world. And then there's Jesus himself, in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The meek, not the powerful, not the colonizers, not the ones with the biggest military or the most advanced technology. The meek, the humble, the oppressed. For 400 years, Western Christianity watched European powers rape Africa and called it the civilizing mission. They watched the slave trade and called it bringing Africans to Christ. They watched colonial exploitation and called it development. But Jesus said the meek would inherit the earth. Not conquer it, not steal it, not exploit it, inherit it. Let me paint you a picture of what Western Christianity supported for centuries. The Berlin Conference of 1884. European powers literally sat around a table and divided Africa among themselves. No Africans invited, no African voices heard, just European men with maps, drawing lines, claiming entire civilizations. And where was the church? Blessing the missions. Sending missionaries who told Africans their cultures were demonic while their governments stole their resources. King Leopold II of Belgium turned Congo into his personal plantation. 10 million Africans died. Western churches raised money for missions while supporting governments that enabled genocide. French colonial policy was designed to extract everything valuable from Africa while keeping Africans poor. Uranium from Niger powered France's nuclear program. Gold from Burkina Faso filled French banks. Diamonds from Central African Republic adorned European royalty and African children. They mined the resources, died in the extraction, watched their wealth shipped to Europe while they starved. Where was Western Christianity? Building schools that taught African children to be grateful for colonization. Training African pastors to preach submission to white authority. Sending missionaries who confused European culture with the gospel. But here's what they forgot. God sees, God remembers, and God keeps his promises. The current awakening. Now watch what's happening with fresh eyes. Ibrahim Traoré is 34 years old. He kicked out French troops, expelled Western mining companies, and told France they could keep their aid because it was really debt slavery. His first act as leader? Made education free from nursery through university. His second? Started building schools with African resources for African children. Thomas Sankara tried this in the 1980s. He was assassinated, likely with Western support. But Traoré studied Sankara's vision and learned from his mistakes. He's building Pan-African alliances, partnering with other African liberation movements, creating economic independence from Western systems. And it's working. Burkina Faso's literacy rates are climbing, child mortality is dropping, agricultural production is increasing, all because they kept their resources instead of shipping them to Europe. Mali, Niger, Chad, the pattern is spreading. Young African leaders who won't bow to Western demands, who won't let their people stay poor so Western nations can stay rich. And here's the spiritual dimension. Western Christianity doesn't want to acknowledge. These leaders are explicitly rejecting the Christianity that came with colonization while embracing indigenous African spirituality and, in many cases, Islam. They're saying, the gospel you brought came with slavery. The Christ you preached looked like our oppressor. We're finding God without your permission. The meek inheriting the earth. This is what Jesus meant when he said the meek would inherit the earth. For centuries, Western powers mocked African governance, African economics, African solutions. They can't manage their own resources. They need Western expertise. They're not ready for independence. But the meek aren't weak. The meek are humble enough to wait for God's timing, patient enough to endure oppression without becoming oppressors, wise enough to inherit rather than steal. Watch how these African leaders are handling power. They're not colonizing other continents. They're not enslaving other races. They're not extracting resources from other nations to build their own wealth. They're simply keeping what's theirs, using their own resources for their own people, building their own schools, hospitals, infrastructure with their own wealth. That's not conquest. That's inheritance. And Western nations are panicking because they built their wealth on African poverty. French nuclear power depends on Nigerian uranium. European jewelry depends on African diamonds. Western technology depends on African minerals. What happens to Western prosperity when Africa keeps its wealth? The same thing that happened to Pharaoh's Egypt when Israel left. The system built on exploitation collapses. Western Christian complicity. Now here's the hard truth. Western Christianity doesn't want to face. We didn't just fail to stop colonization. We blessed it. We sanctified it. We called it God's will. Missionaries went to Africa with genuine hearts, but they carried Western assumptions about civilization, development, and progress. They taught African Christians that European ways were Christian ways, that African cultures were pagan, that liberation movements were rebellion against God. Western churches raised money for African missions while their governments impoverished Africa. They sent Bibles while their militaries enforced extraction. They preached about God's love while enabling systems that treated Africans as subhuman. And when African Christians started reading those Bibles for themselves and finding liberation theology, Western churches called it political and unbiblical. When African Christians said, Jesus looks like us too, Western Christianity said, don't make this about race. When African Christians said, maybe the prosperity you enjoy came from our poverty, Western Christianity said, Don't blame us for the past, but Psalm 68:31 was written for African Christians to find. Isaiah 60 promises that nations will come to Africa's light. Acts 8 shows the first Gentile convert was African, not European. The Bible is full of African liberation theology. Western Christianity just didn't want to see it. The prophetic perspective. So what does this mean prophetically? What is God doing in Africa right now? I believe we're watching the biblical promise of reversal. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. The meek shall inherit the earth. For 400 years, European Christianity dominated global faith. European theology shaped Christian thinking. European missions defined Christian practice. But God is raising up African Christian voices that the Western Church can't control. African theology that doesn't need Western approval. African Christian practices that connect to indigenous African spirituality without compromising biblical truth. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has been following Christ for 1,600 years. African Christians were translating the Bible into African languages before most of Europe was Christianized. The largest Christian populations today are in Africa. But Western Christianity acted like Christianity started in Europe and was exported to Africa as a gift. Like Africans should be grateful for receiving the gospel from their colonizers, God is correcting that narrative. He's showing the world that the gospel belongs to every tribe, tongue, and nation, not just the ones with the most military power. Current implications: a call to Western Christians. Here's what this means for Western Christians watching Africa rise. First, repent for the ways Western Christianity enabled African exploitation. Don't minimize it. Don't explain it away. Own it. Repent of it. Ask African Christians for forgiveness. Second, support African Christian voices without trying to control them. Read African theology. Listen to African biblical interpretation. Learn from African Christian practices. Stop assuming Western Christianity has all the answers. Third, question whether your prosperity came from others' poverty. If your nation's wealth was built on resource extraction from Africa, Asia, or Latin America, acknowledge that. Support economic justice that allows those nations to keep their wealth. Fourth, recognize that God's kingdom isn't Western. It's not European or American. It's every tribe, tongue, and nation. African independence movements aren't threats to Christianity. They're fulfillments of biblical promises. The meek are inheriting the earth. African nations are keeping their resources. African Christians are defining their own theology. African leaders are asserting their dignity. This isn't the end of Christianity. It's the globalization of Christianity. It's Christianity freed from Western control. But here's the question that will determine how Western Christians respond to Africa's rise. Are you celebrating African liberation, or are you mourning Western loss of control? Are you excited that formerly colonized people are claiming their inheritance, or are you worried about what that means for Western prosperity? Are you praising God for African Christian independence, or are you concerned about losing influence over African churches? Because your answer reveals whether you see Christianity as Western religion that should dominate the world, or as global faith that belongs to every nation equally. The meek are inheriting the earth. African Christians are stretching out their hands to God, not through Western intermediaries, but directly. African nations are keeping the wealth God placed in their soil. This is biblical justice. This is prophetic fulfillment. This is the meek inheriting what God always intended them to have. We're not just watching geopolitics, we're watching biblical prophecy unfold. Ethiopia shall stretch out her hands unto God. Check. The meek shall inherit the earth. In progress. Every tribe, tongue, and nation before the throne. Coming soon. Africa is rising not because of military might or economic manipulation, but because God keeps his promises. The meek inherit, the humble are exalted, the oppressed are liberated. Western Christianity can either celebrate this fulfillment of biblical justice or mourn the loss of unbiblical control. But either way, the prophecy is being fulfilled. Comment below. Do you see Africa's rise as threat or fulfillment of biblical promise? Because your answer reveals whether you understand the gospel of liberation or just the gospel of control. The meek are inheriting the earth. The question is, are you cheering for the meek or mourning for the powerful?